One of my favorite days of the week of Holy Week is actually what many call Holy Saturday. One of my former pastors called it Silent Saturday, and I like that term for it. It was different for what we did. We had a men's day at the church on that day before Easter where we prepared breakfast for the whole church. And then we had a devotional. And most of the time, the devotional that we had focused on what it was like to be one of the disciples on that day between, the time between when Jesus was crucified and when he rose from the dead. We tried to imagine what it would be like to be a disciple, to wonder, was he really coming back? At that point, I don't think they even thought that. I think at that point they were too scared. They were worried about what just happened to their Savior, their Messiah, had just been hung on the cross, and they imagined what would happen to them. What would take place? Would they all be hung? Would they all be killed? Would they all end up in the same position that Jesus was at the end? So thinking about anything other than themselves was probably way beyond what they could do at that point. There was terror. There was fear. Now, it's a great perspective to think about what the disciples were thinking, but the Bible doesn't tell us anything about the disciples. The Bible doesn't say anything about what happened between those two times. It doesn't, between the time that Jesus died and the time that he rose from the dead, we read nothing about what was going on with the disciples. Instead, we have a different focus. We have a focus on the soldiers, the Romans. We have a focus on the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Jewish leaders of the time. We know what they were thinking at that point. We know what they were thinking when they thought Jesus was dead and gone. They were happy. They were self-satisfied. They believed that Jesus was a deceiver. They believed he was an imposter. He was a liar and possibly a lunatic. Matthew records the only account we find between the death of Jesus and the resurrection. And again, it isn't an account of the disciples. Instead, we read the next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember how that impostor, that Jesus, that deceiver, while he was still alive, said, 'After 3 days I will rise.'" Now remember this. These are his enemies saying, "We remember what he said." I don't think the disciples were even thinking that at that point, but his enemies knew that. "Therefore, order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he has risen from the dead, and the last fraud will be worse than the first." The last fraud will be worse than the first. The enemies of Jesus were thinking ahead. They knew the disciples might try to trick the public. They might steal the body and say that Jesus rose again. See? No body. Therefore, Jesus must have risen. But I don't believe the disciples had any plans to steal the body. After Peter denied Christ 3 times, I suspect he was in no shape to make any plans or figure out how to take the body. These guys were weaklings in comparison to the Roman government. They were weaklings when it came to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They had no chance, and they knew it. They were dealing with their own doubts. They were dealing with their own questions. They were wondering if they would live to see another day. Steal a body? I question whether they even had that concept in their mind in the first place. But the enemies did. And so they did everything they could to seal that tomb, a Roman seal on it, a guard stationed there. Everything they could to make sure there was no way the disciples could steal the body. And guess what? I'm glad they did that, because it makes what happened next so much more amazing. Pilate said to them, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go, make it as secure as you can." So they went out and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard. This was a big deal. Huge deal. There was no way the disciples could get the body out of the tomb. Precautions were taken. The guard was there and the stone was in the way, and I'm so glad they took every precaution, because it makes what happened next even more powerful, even more impossible. You see, this is the day the imposter became the grave robber. Jesus didn't need the disciples to lie for him. They didn't need to have a secret plan to steal the body. This was the day that Jesus stole death forever. The disciples didn't rob the grave because the grave robber had already accomplished the task. There are 34 distinct miracles that we read about Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And those are the ones that we see recorded. Doesn't mean that's all of them, but those are the ones that we have recorded. Now, the book of John covers 6 of those miracles and 6 alone. Mark Batterson wrote a wonderful book called The Grave Robber, How Jesus Can Make Your Impossible Possible. And in that book, Batterson covers those 6 miracles, but he says there's one more. It's the 7th miracle. It was when Jesus became the grave robber. Batterson says we can't reduce that event as anything less than the most important miracle for each of us today. This is what Batterson says. What's done is done. Some things in life are irreversible. You cannot unbake cookies. You cannot uncut hair. You can't undelete documents or unrun red lights. These are a few of the lessons I've learned the hard way. Some of those lessons were easily laughed off after a little embarrassment. Then there are those irreversible moments that leave a hole in your heart forever, like standing at the foot of a casket. If you've been on the receiving end of divorce papers, answered a frantic phone call in the middle of the night, or gotten lab results from your doctor that confirm your worst fears, you know that feeling all too well. It feels like your life is over, but it's not over until God says it's over. When Jesus left the tomb, impossible became possible. And as the grave robber, Jesus revealed his true identity. He said it himself, and it is the boldest claim of all. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection, I am the life. Whoever believes in me, though he dies, he shall live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. And then the big question, do you believe this? Do you believe this? Did the disciples believe enough on that Holy Saturday to believe that Jesus would not die? It's that unique claim which sets Jesus apart and puts him in a category by himself. He is the Son of God. Christianity is not built on the foundation of a philosophy or a code of ethics. The foundation of our faith is one fundamental fact: the empty tomb. After cheating death by calling Lazarus out of his tomb, Jesus walked out of his own tomb under his own power. If the resurrection didn't happen, Christianity ranks as history's cruelest hoax. We're not just wasting our lives worshiping him, we're living a lie. But if Jesus walked out of the tomb 2,000 years ago, then he is who he says he is. Bono is the lead singer of the rock group U2. In an interview this past year, he was asked the question, who is Jesus Christ? Who is Jesus Christ? Listen to what he said.
So then, what or who was Jesus as far as you're concerned?
I think it's a defining question for a Christian, is who was Christ. And I don't think you're let off easily by saying a great thinker or a great philosopher, or because actually he went round saying he was the Messiah. That's why he was crucified. He was crucified because he said he was the Son of God. So he either, in my view, was the Son of God, or he was
Not.
Nuts.
Nuts, yes.
Forget
Yes.
rock and roll messianic complexes. This is like, Charlie Manson type delirium. And I find it hard to accept that all the millions and millions of lives, half the earth, for 2,000 years, have been touched, have felt their lives touched and inspired by some nutter. I don't believe it.
Therefore it follows that you believe he was divine.
Yes.
And therefore it follows that you believe that he rose physically from the dead.
Yes. Yeah. I'm no problem with miracles.
So Jesus either was who he said he was, or he was a nutter, as he put it. Nuts, crazy, a lunatic. Well, I believe as Bono believes. I believe Jesus is Lord. But I also understand C.S. Lewis was the one who said Jesus was either a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. Has to be one of those. And every one of us has to make that decision in our hearts, what we believe about Jesus. While most people have no issue accepting Jesus as a healer or a teacher or a great man, a religious prophet, but that's not who Jesus said he was. He said he was the Son of God, which leaves no middle ground. Either Jesus is Lord of all, or he's not. So which is it? The one decision will determine your eternal destiny. It will also make the impossible possible. It makes Jesus the grave robber. And I believe in the grave robber. I believe that Jesus is Lord. And because of that, I also believe in three very important things. One, Jesus died so that my sin, whatever I did that was wrong, was nailed to the cross with Christ. Two, Jesus died so that we all may live. And three, he rose again from the dead so that I may live forever. I am crucified with Christ. It is not I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The life I now live is by faith. Jesus is not dead. He was dead, but he's not dead anymore.